Hi, I'm Jonathan Kuhn, Director of Art and Antiquities for the New York City Parks Department. We oversee a collection of monuments, more than 800 monuments citywide, several hundred sculptures from older figural portraiture to contemporary works of art. And the oldest sculpture in our entire collection is the George Washington sculpture that today stands at the south end of Union Square. The sculpture was commissioned in the 1850s, so-called father of our country, and it also coincided with a period of time in which American sculptors were sort of establishing themselves, and American foundries for that matter, something I'll come back to at that time. But up to that point, there had been no other permanent sculptures in the parks except for a sculpture of King George III, which once stood in Bowling Green Park in Lower Manhattan. That particular sculpture suffered an untimely end when, after the first reading of the Declaration of Independence in New York State, colonists who were all riled up but marched to Bowling Green toppled the sculpture and melted it down. There was no other statuary in the parks of New York until this statue was erected. If you had stood in Union Square Park in the 1850s, you'd see a very different park, very different layout that was at sort of ground level, at street level. At its center was a large fountain that had been erected soon after the Croton Reservoir was connected in 1842 to provide fresh water to New York, and there were several fountains put up, one in City Hall Park and one here. And the George Washington was originally placed in a small traffic island in the southeast corner where kind of Lafayette Street becomes 4th Avenue, becomes Park Avenue, and sat within a fenced enclosure in the park. You can see a famous photo taken at the time of a kind of street thugs kind of leaning up against the fence with the sculpture in the middle of the street. The sculpture was erected by a concerned group of citizens. This is, in fact, a typical scenario for most of our public statuary. About 98% of the park's collection has been commissioned through private initiative and private sponsorship, not through public monies. A little-known fact. Other than a handful of sculptures commissioned by the state, and in more recent decades by the Percent for Art program, most of these were done through what's known as popular subscription, public campaigns. They were, of course, subject to whatever the city's design reviews were at a given moment. In 1851, a group of committed citizens formed a committee to erect a monument to Washington in New York, and they first approached the well-known sculptor Horatio Greenough, who is well known for his famous classical marble portrait of Washington in a toga, kind of conflating the New Republic with classical ideals. They also asked at the time a young sculptor named Henry Kirk Brown to submit a design, and it was sort of unclear whether they wanted Henry Kirk Brown to assist Greenough or whether he was actually competing with him for artistic selection. In any event, this possible confusion was eliminated when Greenough suffered a premature death in December 1852, and Brown was awarded the commission. Now, he, like most sculptors of his generation, still made the obligatory visit to Italy to study, to learn the traditional crafts of carving and casting, to soak up the ambiance of centuries of artistic traditions in Italy and elsewhere in Europe. But he was also part of this new group of sculptors, as I say, trying to introduce another being John Quincy Adams Ward, a naturalism. And so he takes in his concept, his ultimate concept in this equestrian, he kind of conflates a number of things going on. You have obviously classical antecedents in this equestrian sculpture. Washington has a kind of pose of benediction, not unlike the Marcus Aurelius sculpture in Rome, and other sculptures from the Renaissance like Bartolomeo. Places like Florence and Venice, equestrian sculpture of the Renaissance. There's also a certain insight especially in the face and some of the details of costume that is very much modern, at least for mid-19th century America. He spent months, assisted actually by John Quincy Adams Ward, working also on the kind of conflation of the horse and rider sculpture. Worked, I believe, portions of the sculpture were conceived in the studio in Brooklyn as well as in Manhattan on the east side. It's also a very early casting by the Ames Foundry in Chicopee, Massachusetts. So it's not a sculpture that was sent overseas for casting. It was cast locally at one of the first foundries. This is up in Chicopee, Massachusetts, and very large casting. And one of the things you can see if you're in a high lift and look down at the plinth of the sculptures, the names of the donors have been inscribed in the skyward face of the bronze subbase, but it's not anything that's visible to the general public. First, they unveiled the pedestal. And this was designed by the well-known architect Richard Upjohn. I think it was one of the largest pieces of granite quarried. It has lovely tooling and molding to it and a real design element to it. And in a ceremony in July, it's conveyed to the city of New York and placed on top. And again, thousands came out to see the sculpture's installation on top of its pedestal. The next day, the New York Herald commented, and I quote, "It is, we hope, the commencement of the good work of beautifying our great metropolis, the people which are fond of art and willing to encourage it." And indeed, it turned out they were correct, that it was not the last, but the first in a long line of public sculptures that has continued to be placed in spaces in New York to this day. Now, much later, in the late 1920s, the park was completely redeveloped, and the subway rebuilt underneath it and expanded, and so the entire park was elevated, and many of the sculptures, like pieces on a chessboard, were relocated. For instance, Abraham Lincoln, also by Henry Kirk Brown, and commissioned about a decade later, which formerly stood in the southwest corner of the park, where Gandhi stands today, was moved to the northern end of the park in a central axial alignment with the flagstaff in the middle of the park, known as the Independence Flagstaff. And George Washington in 1930 was moved out of its area in the middle of traffic to this position of centrality on the south side of the park, where it stands to this day facing south in front of this very active plaza. I like to think of it as our Speaker's Corner in New York, where people act out, protest, do anything. High school kids hang out, and it's really a meeting place, one of the central places of public life in New York. After 9/11 and the attacks on September 11th, this is where people somehow almost instinctively gravitated, and there you can see photographs in the week following 9/11 with sort of thousands of candles around the George Washington sculpture. So interestingly enough, our oldest sculpture, again, served as a touchstone for the public at large, and as a place of grieving, as a public expression of community vigil, and as a kind of provisional shrine. And so it seems to have staying power even in the 21st century.